The Forbidden Door, a haunting Islamic tale you won't forget. The journey had been long and exhausting, but when Hamid finally arrived at the village of Al Jazeera, a strange unease settled in his heart. The sun hung low over the rugged mountains, casting elongated shadows across the narrow dirt pathways. He had come in search of a historical mosque, rumored to house lost Islamic manuscripts, treasures of knowledge that had been hidden away for centuries. But as he walked through the quiet streets, he noticed the wary stares of the villagers. They looked at him not with hostility, but with a peculiar caution, as if they knew something he did not. An old man sitting outside a tea shop beckoned him over. Hamid approached, adjusting his satchel of books. "You are not from here," the old man observed, his voice rough like sandpaper. "No, sir," Hamid replied respectfully. "I am a researcher from Cairo, studying Islamic history. I heard there is a very old mosque here, one that holds ancient manuscripts." The old man's expression darkened. "The Al-Majid Mosque. Yes, it is ancient, but it is also cursed." Hamid's interest peaked. "Cursed? How so?" The old man sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. "There is a door inside the mosque that must never be opened, a door that has remained sealed for generations. It is said that those who enter never return the same, if they return at all." Hamid was skeptical, but intrigued. Legends often surrounded old places, especially ones as significant as an ancient mosque. He thanked the old man and continued his way, dismissing the warning as mere superstition. When he reached the mosque, he was taken aback by its sheer presence. It stood at the edge of the village, partially crumbling, yet imposing in its silence. The calligraphy on its walls had faded with time, but remnants of Quranic verses still glowed under the dimming sunlight. He stepped inside, greeted by the scent of old parchment and dust. The air was thick, almost suffocating. As he wandered through the prayer hall, his eyes landed on an arched doorway at the far end of the mosque. Unlike the rest of the structure, this door was different. It was made of blackened wood, its surface etched with verses that had been scratched out. A heavy iron lock sealed it shut. Hamid felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Something about the door called to him, whispering secrets he could not quite grasp. He took a step closer, placing a hand on the cold wood. A sudden chill ran up his spine. "Step away from there!" a voice called out sharply. Hamid turned to find the mosque's caretaker, an elderly man with piercing eyes. He rushed forward, gripping Hamid's arm tightly. "You must never go near this door," he hissed. "Do you understand?" Hamid nodded, though his mind raced with questions. Why is it locked? What lies beyond it? The caretaker's face paled. "Things that should remain undisturbed," he whispered. "Go about your research, young man, but leave that door alone." That night, Hamid could not sleep. He stayed in the village's small inn, but his thoughts remained fixated on the forbidden door. Why was it sealed? What had the villagers been so afraid of? The rational part of him knew that superstition often shrouded places of historical importance, but deep down, he could not shake the feeling that something about that door was wrong. As the wind howled outside, he sat by the small window, staring at the mosque in the distance. A sense of foreboding washed over him. He had come seeking knowledge, but what if he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous? Then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. The mosque's door creaked open ever so slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness within. And just for a brief moment, he swore he saw something move inside. Hamid's breath hitched as he stared through the small window of his room. The mosque stood silent under the pale moonlight, its silhouette outlined against the darkened sky. But the sight that sent shivers down his spine was the forbidden door. It was slightly ajar, a narrow sliver of blackness beyond its frame. He blinked rapidly, unsure if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. Perhaps it was just the wind, or maybe the caretaker had gone inside for some reason. Yet, deep within him, an unshakable feeling of unease rooted itself. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time Hamid closed his eyes, he felt as if something was watching him, lurking just beyond his vision. The shadows in his room seemed darker than usual, stretching unnaturally along the walls. At one point, he thought he heard soft whispers, like hushed voices carried by the wind. But when he sat up, straining his ears, all he heard was the distant hoot of an owl. Morning could not have come sooner. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Hamid got dressed hurriedly and made his way back to the mosque. The village was just beginning to stir, and a few of the locals eyed him warily, their gazes filled with unspoken warnings. He ignored them, his curiosity now overpowering his apprehension. Upon reaching the mosque's entrance, he hesitated. The heavy wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, revealing the dim interior. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting golden beams over the worn prayer rugs and the ancient stone walls. Hamid's eyes immediately darted to the far end of the mosque. The forbidden door was closed again. His pulse quickened. Had he imagined the whole thing? Had it only been a trick of the night? He walked toward it cautiously, heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he noticed something he hadn't before. Faint, blackened fingerprints on the edges of the door, as if someone or something had touched it. The iron lock was still in place, but a thin layer of dust on the ground was disturbed, as though the door had indeed been opened recently. A sharp voice startled him. "You are back." Hamid spun around to see the caretaker standing behind him, his expression unreadable. "I saw the door open last night," Hamid admitted, his voice low. "Was it you?" The caretaker's face grew grim. "No one touches this door," he said firmly. "And if you are wise, you will leave it be." "But why?" Hamid pressed. "What is behind it?" The caretaker's gaze flickered with something close to fear. "Something that does not belong in our world," he whispered. "You are an educated man, are you not? Then take heed of the warnings given to you." Hamid clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. He had always believed that knowledge was meant to be sought, not hidden away behind locked doors and cryptic warnings. That night, against all reason, he made a decision. He would open the door himself. The mosque was eerily silent when Hamid slipped inside under the cover of darkness. He carried a lantern, its flickering glow casting ghostly shadows along the walls. The air was colder than before, and an unnatural stillness seemed to press down upon him. Standing before the forbidden door, he hesitated only for a moment before reaching out. His fingers brushed against the iron lock, and to his astonishment, it fell open with a dull clink. The breath hitched in his throat. Had it been unlocked all along? Or had someone or something unlocked it for him? Swallowing his fear, he pushed the door open. A gust of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of age-old dust and something else. Something rotten. He lifted his lantern, peering into the darkness beyond. It was a chamber, its walls lined with ancient manuscripts stacked haphazardly on stone shelves. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment, but what caught Hamid's attention was the object standing at the center of the room. A mirror. It was unlike any mirror he had ever seen, tall and narrow, its glass darkened with age. Arabic inscriptions curled along its edges, almost as if they had been carved into the frame itself. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something unsettling about it. He stepped closer. The air seemed to hum around him, a barely perceptible vibration in the silence. Then, his reflection moved, not in the way a normal reflection should. It did not mimic his actions perfectly. Instead, it hesitated, lagging behind by just a fraction of a second, and then it smiled. Hamid stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. That was not him. The figure in the mirror was not him. The smile grew wider, stretching beyond what should be humanly possible. The reflection's eyes darkened, becoming two endless voids. And then, in a voice that did not belong to him, it spoke. "You should not have come." Hamid let out a strangled cry, dropping the lantern as he staggered backward. The flame flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows across the chamber. The temperature plummeted, and the whispering voices he had heard the night before returned, growing louder, rising into an eerie chant. Then, from the mirror, a hand emerged. It was long and thin, its skin an unnatural shade of black, as if burned beyond recognition. The fingers curled, reaching for him. The whispers turned into wails, and the room trembled. Hamid scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming for him to run. But as he turned, he saw something even more horrifying. The door. It was closing. He lunged for it just as the mirror's hand swiped through the air where he had been standing a moment ago. His fingers gripped the edge of the door, yanking it open and throwing himself out. The wailing stopped instantly. The moment he was outside, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening boom. Panting heavily, he stumbled back, staring at the now sealed entrance. The mosque was as silent as before, as if nothing had happened. But the mark of his escape was clear. His lantern still lay on the ground, its flame sputtering weakly. A slow, dreadful realization settled over him. He had made a terrible mistake. Something had seen him, and worse, something knew he was here. Hamid sat motionless on his bed in the village inn, his fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as he tried to steady his breathing. The room felt suffocatingly small, the air thick with an unshakable dread. His mind replayed the events of the night before. The door opening, the dark chamber, the mirror, and the thing inside it. "You should not come." The words still echoed in his ears, a whisper that seemed to slither through his thoughts like a venomous serpent. Had he truly seen what he thought he had? Was his mind playing tricks on him? He wanted to believe that. He wanted to convince himself that exhaustion had warped his senses. But deep down, he knew. It was real. Something unnatural lurked behind that door. And now, it had seen him. A sudden knock at his door made him flinch. His heart pounded as he hesitated, before finally getting up and opening it. It was the caretaker. The old man's eyes immediately searched Hamid's face, his expression grim. "You opened it, didn't you?" Hamid looked away, shame and fear twisting inside him. The caretaker let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You have done something very dangerous, my son." His voice was weary, but not angry. "And now, it will not leave you alone." Hamid swallowed hard. What is it?" The caretaker stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Sit," he instructed. Hamid obeyed, his legs feeling weak. "The door was sealed for a reason," the old man began, his voice low. "Many centuries ago, a scholar, much like yourself, came to this village. He was a man of great knowledge, but also great arrogance. He sought to understand the unseen world, to gain power over things beyond human comprehension. And so, he performed rituals, chanted words forbidden to mankind, and in doing so, he opened a gateway." Hamid felt his blood run cold. "The mirror," he whispered. The caretaker nodded. That was not a mirror. It was a prison. A heavy silence filled the room. Hamid's mouth was dry. What was inside it? The caretaker's eyes darkened. A Djinn. Hamid's body tensed. He had read about Djinn before. The Quran spoke of their existence, creatures of smokeless fire, neither angels nor men, capable of immense power. Some were benevolent, others were not. "This one is old," the caretaker continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was trapped long ago, sealed away so it could not cross into our world. But now that you have disturbed its prison, it will try to latch onto you." Hamid's stomach twisted. "Latch onto me? What do you mean?" The caretaker leaned forward, his expression grim. "It will haunt you, whisper to you. It will invade your dreams, twist your reality. It will try to break your faith, to push you into despair. And if you are not careful, it will consume you." A cold sweat broke out over Hamid's skin. "Is there a way to stop it?" he asked desperately. The caretaker hesitated. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but you must strengthen your faith. Read Surah Al-Baqarah every night. Recite Ayatul Kursi before you sleep. And whatever happens, do not listen to its voice." Hamid nodded quickly, determined to follow the instructions, but deep inside, fear gnawed at him. Because he knew. The Djinn was already watching. That night, Hamid followed the caretaker's advice. He prayed with more devotion than he ever had before, seeking refuge in Allah's words. He read Surah Al-Baqarah, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his heart. But as the candlelight flickered beside him, a chilling sensation crawled up his spine. He was not alone. The room's shadows seemed deeper than before, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. Hamid forced himself to focus on his recitation, refusing to acknowledge the feeling creeping over him. Then, as he reached the final verses, a whisper, software, almost gentle, right beside his ear. "You cannot escape me." Hamid's entire body tensed. He clenched his jaw, gripping the Quran tighter. He would not look, he would not listen. The whispering continued, its voice smooth, almost mocking. "You are a man of knowledge, are you not? Do you not want to understand, to see?" Hamid shut his eyes. "Just look at the mirror, Hamid." His breath hitched. Slowly, involuntarily, his eyes moved toward the far end of the room, toward the small, dusty mirror above the old wooden dresser. And there, in the reflection, someone was standing behind him. A dark figure, too tall, too thin, its face obscured in the shadows. Hamid's body refused to move. A suffocating pressure filled the room, pressing down on his chest like an iron weight. Then the figure tilted its head and smiled, the exact same unnatural smile from the chamber's mirror.
A shuddering breath escaped Hamid's lips. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to focus. Ayatul Kursi. Recite it. Now. His lips trembled as he began. The pressure in the room grew heavier. The air turned icy. The whispering turned into a hiss. The shadows shifted. The figure moved. A sharp screech filled the air, piercing, inhuman. The mirror shattered. And then, silence. Hamid gasped, collapsing onto his knees, his body trembling violently. The room was empty once more. The air, still and lifeless. But he knew. This was only the beginning. Morning brought no comfort. The villagers refused to meet his gaze. The caretaker only sighed when Hamid told him what had happened. "It will not stop so easily," he warned. "It has been imprisoned for centuries. Now that it has found a weakness, it will try to break you." Hamid swallowed hard. "What do I do?" "You must seek someone who can help you seal it away," the caretaker said gravely. "There is a scholar, a man of great faith. He lives deep in the desert, far from here. He may have the knowledge to fight what you have unleashed." Hamid's hands clenched into fists. He had made a terrible mistake. But if there was a way to fix it, to stop the Djinn from tormenting him, he would do whatever it took. And so, as the sun set over the cursed village, he prepared for a journey. A journey to fight something unseen. Something ancient. Something that whispered his name in the dark. Hamid rode through the barren desert, his horse kicking up sand beneath the weight of his urgency. The scorching sun blazed overhead, but it was not the heat that troubled him, it was the feeling of something trailing behind him, just out of sight. The whispers had not stopped. Even in the light of day, they slithered through his thoughts, tempting, taunting, threatening. "Why do you run, Hamid?" His grip on the reins tightened. He recited Ayat al-Kursi under his breath, trying to drown out the voice. "The man you seek cannot save you." Hamid clenched his teeth. He would not listen. He would not acknowledge it. The village caretaker had given him directions before he left, pointing him toward an old scholar who lived in isolation, a man known for his deep knowledge of the unseen. If anyone could help him, it was this man. Still, doubt gnawed at his mind. What if it was too late? What if the Djinn had already marked him beyond salvation? As the day turned to evening, he spotted a small, humble home built near a dry riverbed. A lone meswak tree stood beside it, its gnarled branches swaying slightly despite the stillness of the air. Hamid dismounted and approached. Before he could knock, the door creaked open. A frail but wise-looking man with a white beard and piercing eyes stood before him. His gaze lingered on Hamid for a long moment, as if he could see the thing that tormented him. "I have been expecting you," the scholar said softly. Hamid's heart pounded. "You know why I've come?" The old man nodded. "Come inside. There is little time." The room was dimly lit, lined with bookshelves filled with ancient manuscripts. The scholar motioned for Hamid to sit on the worn carpet while he prepared tea over a small fire. "You have disturbed something that should have remained forgotten," the scholar said finally. "The Djinn bound to that mirror is not ordinary. It was imprisoned by the early scholars of this land, locked away after it caused great destruction." Hamid exhaled shakily. "Can it be stopped?" The old man handed him a cup of tea and sat across from him. "Yes. But it will not leave easily. It has attached itself to you, Hamid. It has tasted your fear, and now it seeks to break your spirit." Hamid swallowed hard. "What must I do?" The scholar's gaze darkened. "You must face it. You must confront it with unwavering faith. This creature feeds on weakness, on doubt. It will try to deceive you, to make you despair. But if you stand firm in your belief, it cannot harm you." Hamid's hands trembled slightly as he placed the cup down. "And if I fail?" The old man's expression was grim. "Then it will not stop until it has fully possessed you." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, the scholar rose. "Come. The night is upon us. We must begin." The two men stepped outside, where the air was unnaturally still. A circle had been drawn in the sand, filled with Quranic inscriptions and protective symbols. The scholar motioned for Hamid to stand in the center. "This is a test of your faith," he said. "No matter what happens, do not leave the circle. Do not let it trick you. Do not give in to fear." Hamid nodded, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. The scholar began to recite verses from the Quran, his voice steady and powerful. The air around them seemed to change, growing thicker, heavier. The sky above darkened unnaturally, despite the stars twinkling overhead. Then, a whisper. Low and insidious, curling through the air like smoke. "Hamid. Hamid, why do you fight me?" Hamid squeezed his eyes shut. He focused on the scholar's voice, on the Quranic verses filling the air. "Do you think your faith will save you?" A gust of wind howled through the desert, kicking up sand, though the circle remained untouched. Hamid refused to respond. Then, he heard it. His mother's voice. "Hamid, my son, help me." His eyes snapped open. His breath caught in his throat. There, just outside the circle, stood his mother. She looked exactly as he remembered her, her kind face filled with sadness. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Hamid, please," she begged. Why won't you help me? His body moved instinctively, his feet shifting toward her. No, the scholar's voice boomed. It is a trick. Hamid hesitated, confusion twisting his insides. But she looked so real. Could it really be a deception? My son, she whispered again. I am trapped, come with me, please. Hamid took another step. The scholar shouted Ayatul Kursi. Hamid's heart pounded. His lips moved before he could think. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. A blood-curdling shriek ripped through the air. The image of his mother twisted before his eyes, her form elongating, her face melting into something monstrous. Her mouth stretched open far too wide, revealing rows of blackened teeth. Her eyes darkened into endless pits. You will never be free of me, the voice shrieked, no longer human. The sky trembled. The air rippled. The shadows lunged. The scholar raised his hands, his voice booming with verses of the Quran. The circle glowed faintly, its inscriptions burning with an ethereal light. The creature howled, a sound so unnatural it made Hamid's bones vibrate. The sand beneath him quaked. The shadows writhed. Hamid continued his recitation, his voice growing stronger. The Djinn screamed. A sudden blast of wind roared through the desert. The pressure in the air snapped. And then, silence. The darkness vanished. The whispers ceased. Hamid collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The scholar stood beside him, his expression unreadable. It is weakened, the old man murmured. But not gone. Hamid looked up, his face drenched in sweat. What do you mean? The scholar helped him to his feet. You moo. Hamid stood at the edge of the village, his heart heavy with dread. The scholar's words echoed in his mind. You must return to the mosque. You must seal the door. And this time, it must never be opened again. He gripped the Quran tightly in his hands, his only weapon against the unseen. The journey back had been uneventful, yet an eerie stillness had settled over the land, as though something was waiting for him. Watching. The villagers kept their distance, whispering amongst themselves. They had always feared the cursed mosque, but now, they feared Hamid as well. He ignored them. He had a duty to finish what he had started. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking gates of the mosque and stepped inside. The air was thick with silence. Dust floated lazily in the dim light of the setting sun, casting long, haunting shadows along the prayer hall. Hamid could feel it, the presence lurking, waiting, unseen but ever watchful. The caretaker was nowhere to be found. Perhaps he had left, unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. Hamid did not blame him. He made his way down the old stone corridors, the sound of his own footsteps unsettling in the stillness. And then, he reached the door. It stood exactly as before. Heavy, ancient, and slightly ajar. The golden inscriptions above it were still visible, though dulled with age. Hamid swallowed hard. He knew what lay beyond it. And he knew that it knew he had returned. With trembling hands, he opened the Quran and began reciting Surah al-Baqarah. Alif Lam Mim. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for those conscious of Allah. The air shifted. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the mosque. The walls shuddered. Hamid's grip on the Quran tightened. He took a step forward. The mirror was still there. Cracked. Shattered. But still pulsing with a darkness beyond human understanding. A shape flickered within the glass. A figure. Tall. Twisted. Smiling. Hamid's breath hitched, but he did not stop reciting. Those who disbelieve, it is all the same for them, whether you warn them or do not warn them, they will not believe. The whispering began again. Hamid. It slithered through the air, wrapping around him like invisible chains. You cannot defeat me. The shadows coiled. The walls groaned. The Djinn's reflection twisted, its eyes blacker than the void itself. You belong to me now. A gust of wind exploded through the chamber, sending debris flying. The mirror rippled, as though it was struggling to break free. But Hamid did not waver. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. A deafening screech tore through the air. The Djinn writhed, its form distorting, unraveling. The Quran's words burned it. Hamid did not stop. The light in the chamber grew brighter. The mirror cracked further. The Djinn let out a final, unearthly shriek. And then... silence. The air stilled. The oppressive darkness lifted. The mirror, gone. Nothing remained but the dust and the old stones of the chamber. Hamid let out a shuddering breath. It was over. The Djinn had been cast back into the unseen. The door had been sealed, for good. As Hamid stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The village felt lighter. As if a great shadow had been lifted. The caretaker stood at the mosque gates, watching him with an expression of quiet relief. It is done, he asked. Hamid nodded. It is done. The old man let out a deep sigh. You have done what many could not, my son. Hamid simply looked at the sky. The weight in his chest had lifted, but he knew. The unseen world would always exist. And some doors must remain forever closed.